Hello everybody. So, confession time. This is not my first crack at this topic. I had an entire separate version of this video scripted and recorded, but it got pushed to the back burner for a little while, and I came back to it and I wasn't really happy with it, so I decided to basically start from scratch. And this is a topic I've wanted to discuss for a while, but have resisted because I feel like it's an inherently confrontational and controversial topic. The topic of why certain franchises die while others thrive, and my issues with the culture surrounding dormant franchises. So keep in mind while you're watching this video, when I'm discussing toxic behavior, I am in no way implying that everyone takes part in said toxic behavior. I'm only discussing the people who do. I'll start this off by saying, I think everyone in the world is to some degree an egotist, and that's a good thing, because believing in yourself, having self-worth, these are positive traits in moderation. But I feel as though unchecked egotism can manifest itself in a lot of rather unhealthy ways, and amongst gamers, you tend to see one's own egotism manifest in a way that puts unfounded importance on things they like, meanwhile downplaying the things they don't like. This is especially the case on social media, where algorithms will push things into your feed that you will like, or in cases like Reddit, where you can join groups specifically tailored to your interests. Social media, among other things, encourages this misplaced importance because it's a good way to keep you on their platforms so you can see more ads. I remember this meme circulating a while back, and it gave me pause because what I saw here was a series of franchises that weren't popular being compared to a series of franchises that were popular. But a certain demographic of people tend to downplay that popularity in order to push a thought pattern that historically has been mostly incorrect. Because the God's honest truth is, the reason why a lot of your favorite franchises die is that they're simply not as popular or as important as you think they are. Game development these days is a very expensive thing, even with lower tier games. While I do believe that there's a lot of overspending in major game development, that doesn't downplay the fact that with technology and general sensibilities evolving the way they have, they've evolved to the point where the base level of how much games cost is more than they were back before things like physics engines or motion capture or even HD graphics became a requirement in a lot of cases. There was once a time when you could have a game sell 1, 2, or 300,000 copies and still make a modest profit. But in many cases, that's not the case anymore, which is why you don't see many legacy video game franchises these days and why you saw so many of them go away in the early to mid 2010s. If an entire company shifts their philosophy into a direction that you don't like, but they end up making more money than ever, then maybe you're in the minority, but it's okay to be in the minority. I think there's no bigger example of a surprisingly unpopular game series than Mega Man. This is a series known for its longevity, its iconic imagery, its quality gameplay, and how it inspired so many games in the modern age. But let me tell you something, Capcom is one of the few developers or publishers that actually posts all of their sales figures over 1 million copies. But do you want to take a guess how far you have to scroll down the list to find a single Mega Man game? At time of writing, 65 entries. And despite being a series of over 100 games, only 7 Mega Man games have sold over 1 million copies. 2 of those were legacy collections, and 3 of them couldn't even crack the top 100, barely selling over 1 million units. There's such a disconnect between how iconic this franchise is and how popular it actually is. And why is that? I genuinely could not tell you why. But that's why you don't see so many Mega Man games these days, and why the franchise went on a 10-year hiatus at one point. It was clearly a series that was built on small but consistent profits, and was a franchise spearheaded by a single man. Once both those elements went away, what reason did Capcom have to keep the franchise going when they could make a Street Fighter game, a Resident Evil game, a Devil May Cry game, or a Monster Hunter game and sell 10 times as many copies? Mega Man has a massive profile on social media, which is why you see so many people pining for more, but from Capcom's perspective, what reason do they have? Not historical precedent, that's for sure. I feel like that million unit figure is a good point of reference to pinpoint the bare minimum of what it might take for a game to be profitable these days. In many cases, it's much more than that, but if you can't even crack 1 million, you have no hope. Let's take Konami now, a publisher who has a very mixed history these days, but there's no doubt that they're another example of a developer/publisher who has a lot of iconic IP in their back pocket, but a lot of which don't nearly have the same amount of clout as you'd think. Contra is a long-running franchise that has allegedly sold 5 million copies collectively, but not one entry has ever sold over 1 million copies. Or Castlevania, which is another long-standing series that has an unparalleled legacy and has inspired so many games, but has only ever had 3 entries sell over 1 million units. The first Lords of Shadow, the original Castlevania, and Symphony of the Night. Then you have something like Silent Hill, one of the progenitors of the survival horror genre, which at time of writing has sold 9 million copies collectively, but of the many games in this iconic franchise, only 2 of them have ever sold over 1 million copies, and they were the first 2 games. Then you have Bomberman, a series so traditionally unpopular, it was newsworthy when Super Bomberman R broke the 2 million unit mark. And once again, I could not tell you why these seemingly iconic franchises are so paradoxically unpopular. Especially when you have something like Metal Gear Solid, which is a very popular franchise by the same publisher and has all the makings of a niche series. But it managed to break away and become not only one of the most iconic, but one of the best-selling video game franchises in history. If I had to guess, I think it's because Metal Gear Solid, when it first came out, had a novelty to it, being easily the most cinematic game to ever exist at the time. A novelty that attracted a casual audience that never let go, whereas I guess these other franchises were either too inherently niche in their sensibilities or never had the same novelty to a casual audience to attract as many long-term fans. But either way, that's why you don't see these franchises much these days, because historically, well, these franchises have never sold well. At the end of the day, the main issue here is casual fans versus hardcore fans. Hardcore fans will theoretically buy anything you put out in these franchises that they like, but the casual audience also outnumbers the hardcore audience 10 to 1 at least. And what makes something appeal to a casual audience will vary from situation to situation. Conker's Bad Fur Day, for example, was a game that at the time of its release had absolutely no appeal. Hear me out. There's an audience for ironic, subversive games these days in the larger age of irony, and now that games as a medium are more established, but back then, adults weren't gonna buy it because it was a genre of games largely associated with children's games, and then the only kids who were going to get it bought for them were the ones whose parents were dozy enough to not notice the very clear warnings on the front of the box. So that's a case where it's easy as hell to pinpoint exactly why it flopped. If it were released today, it would probably be relatively popular. But really, that's just the evolution of audience desires, something you see quite a lot of in the larger gaming landscape. Hence why things like Crash and Spyro were so ungodly popular in the 90s, but then as soon as the 2000s hit, they fell off completely and had a near-decade hiatus. And why Rayman is suddenly relevant after nearly a decade of basically nothing, because they decided to take the kiddie platformer thing and turn him into a sweary SOB, although I'm not sure if I can use Rayman as an example for this list, considering that after several re-releases, Rayman Legends is officially the best-selling game in the Rayman series as of 2019. So even if the series did fall off in the mid to late 2000s, it's a wonder why Ubisoft isn't doing anything with this series now. In fact, Ubisoft as a whole is a bit of a perplexing case, because while they do have a lot of iconic intellectual property that has traditionally sold well, it's a bit of a dice toss to know if they stopped making individual franchises because of dwindling popularity or for reasons that only make sense to them. The only one that I can definitely say was a flop was Beyond Good and Evil, which would probably explain why the sequel has been stuck in development hell for more than half my life. God, that's depressing. Now let's take a look at Nintendo, because they're a company that has historically been, at various points, good and bad at maintaining their legacy IP. And some of it is even kind of questionable to begin with, if the IP is mistreated, unpopular, or just played out. Earthbound, for example, is it mistreated, or have they done everything they want to do with it? F-Zero hasn't sold over 1 million copies in a single game since 2001. Is the franchise inherently unpopular in the modern age, or did they just run out of things they could do with it? More to the point, will F-Zero 99 be the shot in the arm that revives the franchise? Who knows? Star Fox, though, that's a case where I think the franchise is paradoxically unpopular despite how iconic the franchise should be. It has not sold over 1 million copies since 2002, with the exception of the 3DS remake of 64, which probably sent all the wrong messages to Nintendo. But even then, the pseudo-reimagining of Star Fox 64, Star Fox Zero, is one of the worst-selling Nintendo-made Wii U exclusives. Poor marketing, unappealing game, or dead franchise? Well, to give you an indication, Star Fox Command came out on the DS, which had the second biggest install base in the history of gaming at time of writing. But even then, it couldn't crack 1 million copies, so unfortunately I have to assume that it is a dead franchise. But either way, the consistent unpopularity of Star Fox will give Nintendo pause if another game is ever pitched. Then you have something like Golden Sun, which had 2 games that sold relatively decently and 1 game that sold like shit. Then there are tons of other individual examples of franchises over the years that had mediocre popularity despite being considered some of the greats. Ninja Gaiden, despite having many games and several re-releases, has allegedly sold less than 7 million units collectively. Klonoa, a truly beloved franchise, lauded for its tight gameplay and adorable aesthetics, but every main game was known to be a flop to the point that it was surprising the remake ever got made. Anybody remember Skylanders? That was a series that was a billion-dollar franchise at one point, then in a matter of like 5 years completely bottomed out, with Imaginators only selling something like 66,000 copies in the first month. Well, how about Pac-Man? Arguably the first video game mascot, but unfortunately outside of iOS and Android hasn't sold anything exceptionally well in God knows how long. Legacy of Kain was another one that had its heyday back on the PS1, but then faltered with several sequels that never broke the million-unit mark. I could find probably dozens of examples of this, beloved franchises that were unfortunately never particularly popular or were once popular but then died off. But there is one more big company, and I wanted to save the biggest for last, the company that is probably the most notorious for leaving its franchises to rot: PlayStation. Now, originally this part of the video was going to be a bit speculatory because much like a lot of companies, their public game sales were rough estimates if they weren't directly publicized. That wasn't until recently when an internal sales record of over 100 PlayStation exclusive games from throughout the years was leaked from games that sold as much as 25 million to as little as 120,000. I can't be 100% sure of the validity, but for the games that have publicized sales data, it's all consistent, and if this is fake, I don't see what the purpose would be if there's no clear agenda. That's a lot of work to go through for no reason. There's a lot of interesting insight into franchise popularity here. I think the most interesting thing to consider are the games that didn't even make the list. Ape Escape didn't even make the list. The Legend of Dragoon made the list.
Wait, why was I?
Halftime entertainment!
Frankly, I'm just happy to be included.
But based on what information I can gather, the first game sold relatively well as sort of a tech demo for the DualShock controller. Meanwhile, the sequel, and especially the threequel, sold atrociously. Then there's Parappa the Rapper, where the first game sold respectably, meanwhile allegedly the sequel sold less than 1/10 of that number. Or Knack, which had its first game sell respectably as a launch title to the PS4, then the sequel's sales dropped off the map. Or how about Little Big Planet? It had 3 games that sold pretty well, then Sackboy: A Big Adventure had a massive sales drop-off despite coming out on 3 separate platforms compared to Little Big Planet 3, which came out on 2 separate platforms. Gravity Rush is another one that didn't even make the list, but that's also another one that by all sales indications that I could find couldn't surpass 1 million units for either of its entries. Then there's Jak and Daxter. It surprised me to find out that the very first Jak and Daxter game sold relatively well, as in one of the best-selling PS2 exclusives well. Then it had a severe drop-off in the second game, a further drop-off with the third game, and the fourth game, aka Jak X Racing, didn't even make the list, but internally I've heard it's considered the worst-selling PlayStation-based Naughty Dog game, although it probably outsold the likes of Way of the Warrior. Medieval didn't make the list in any of its iterations, but reports state that the first game didn't crack 1 million units, though that's a rough estimation. The second game sold worse, and both remakes underperformed. And hey, I got a cop to this one. Twisted Metal, a franchise I've spent the last couple years covering both first and second hand. Well, you got several games that surpassed 1 million units sold, but nothing that made it past 2 million, and the last one to sell over 1 million units was back in 2001. So basically, the vast majority of their legacy IP was never particularly popular or proved to be unpopular in the long term. And meanwhile, if you look at their top 20 best-selling PlayStation exclusive games, it's exclusively filled with new IP, new iterations of old IP, and Gran Turismo. It's hard to say why a lot of intellectual property doesn't have staying power or the legs to be popular. Maybe it's marketing, maybe it's appeal, maybe it's demographics, maybe it's Maybelline. At the end of the day, market research exists for a reason. Are modern PlayStation games samey and repetitious? In certain ways, yes, but that's because these are the games that people will buy, and there's historical precedent for this. In fact, full disclosure, the impetus for this video was a couple of things that happened with Jim Ryan. First of all was many moons ago when he said that story-rich third-person games were the future of PlayStation, which translated to, yeah, that thing we're doing right now that's seen our greatest first-party success in history, yeah, we're gonna continue doing that. People still got very mad at this. The second was when Jim Ryan announced that he was retiring and people rejoiced as if Lex Luthor had been taken down by Superman. Let me preface this by saying, I don't know Jim Ryan, but I'm pretty sure he's not a real-life supervillain who's been attempting to destroy PlayStation from the inside. He is just the guy steering the ship towards what makes the most money. I'd imagine there's no ulterior motive other than that. And for the record, Jim Ryan has also held his position in PlayStation for decades, so if you don't like the current direction of PlayStation and want to blame him, please note that he very likely also oversaw the era of PlayStation that you liked. I feel like this practice of demonizing people for rather mundane things is a really stupid practice.
Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Matter of fact, let's go back to that meme from earlier. You see, things like this is the manifestation of toxic egotism in gaming. Denying things that are true, pushing things that aren't true, and also doing it in a toxic way that downplays a lot of hard work by a lot of people, and essentially gatekeeps what you are and aren't allowed to enjoy. This is the part of the video where it's basically impossible for me to discuss my feelings without ruffling feathers, because this is something that a lot of people get weirdly angry at, that is to say, the state of modern PlayStation exclusives. But here's the thing. I've been with PlayStation for most of my life, largely whether I liked it or not. Those were the consoles that I basically ended up with. Either way, I've played most of these franchises and like most of them. I like The Last of Us, but I also generally like Jak and Daxter, except for the third game. Really, it's Uncharted I'm most lukewarm on. But either way, I don't discriminate against old Naughty Dog or new Naughty Dog. In fact, I don't discriminate against old PlayStation or new PlayStation. I really enjoyed the first Ape Escape game, the later entries I can take or leave. I enjoy Medieval, and I even enjoyed the remake. I have fond memories of Little Big Planet and Ratchet & Clank, and y'all already know what I think about Infamous, Twisted Metal, and God of War. Matter of fact, I'm gonna throw a bone to my old school fans. Legend of Dragoon, one of my favorite games of all time. For me, it's not about what is and isn't popular or what is and isn't good, because success does not equal subjective quality, as there are a lot of popular games that I think are crap and a lot of unpopular games that I love. It's about having the intellectual honesty and self-awareness of our own egotism to understand that just because we like something doesn't mean it's popular enough to justify a sequel, and just because something is important to you doesn't mean it's important to everyone or is important generally, and the opposite is true as well. Just because something is popular that you don't like, it shouldn't downplay the popularity, and more to the point, doesn't mean it's also important to other people. And never more will you see more consistent misplacement of importance and toxic attitudes towards popular games, or never more will you see people taking the popularity or lack of popularity of various game franchises more weirdly personally than with PlayStation discourse. The phrase of the day is intellectual dishonesty, because the amount of vitriol I see get sent to developers by people who can't mentally reconcile these things is quite frankly sickening. To me, this is what the whole thing comes down to. Not being able to mentally reconcile these things is one thing, but making it everyone else's problem is where things start to get toxic. And I believe that developers should be able to make what they want and not be held to arbitrary standards. And even though we're mostly talking about PlayStation right now, that goes for every developer. There's also a tendency towards cognitive dissonance, I find. Over the years, I've seen hundreds of variations on the phrase, X developer needs to go back to making creative games instead of the games they're making now, and their definition of creativity is sequels to games they grew up with, or games like them. Which isn't creativity, it's regurgitation. To those people, you can just say you want old franchises back without presenting it as some sort of greater issue than it is. Because that is an egregious level of intellectual dishonesty. I feel like it's a tired, regurgitated talking point that people repeat without actually understanding the point they're trying to make. Despite having a working understanding of it, I've never played a Horizon game, and I probably never will because I have no interest. Doesn't mean it's not successful or creative. I also haven't played a Mario game in years because this is a franchise that doesn't really interest me, but it's still to video games what Mickey Mouse is to cinema. Either way, it's not worth taking these things seriously or personally, because the popularity of a game you like or lack thereof does not diminish your ability to enjoy it, and the success of things you don't like doesn't automatically make it bad. You don't need validation to like something, and if you want the validation of your favorite things being popular, then you're in this for the wrong reasons. Like seriously, be more secure in the things you like. It's okay for things to be niche, and it's okay to like things that are niche and not have to treat them as something bigger than what they are. It's also worth saying that this attitude of vastly overinflating the importance of things people like while downplaying the things they don't like ties into a somewhat more rare but nonetheless infuriating mindset that I've seen on various social medias that Sony quote-unquote forces their studios to move away from their legacy IP and into making these other games. I saw that sentiment a couple of times with Sucker Punch and Ghost of Tsushima, and I said this way back during that Ghost of Tsushima video that nobody watched, but games this good aren't made by accident or by force. Matter of fact, the opposite is true. Here's what Nate Fox himself said on the matter of legacy IP.
While it's fun to live and stay with your family, it's useful to move, and it's useful to go somewhere new and have new experiences. And I think that was something that we were pretty clear on, that we knew we were going to do Sly 3 and then we were going to go do new IP.
Games are made when a developer wants to make it, and the publisher believes, based on historical precedent and market research, that it will turn a profit. And when people claim that certain developers are being forced to make games they're currently making instead of their legacy IP, once again goes back to toxic egotism. Because of this attitude of, if I don't like what they're currently making, then how could anybody like it or want to be involved with it? That's basically the mindset, treating developers as cattle to make games that I like instead of the things that will make them successful. And it's like, why are they obligated to do that? I want to encourage people to be fans of the people behind the games they make rather than the games they make themselves. Don't be this guy. Once again, it's rare that it goes that far, but it still irks me to see anybody pour their heart and souls into something and have the whole thing be downplayed. And I feel that one probably gets me more than most, because I also suffer from a debilitating disease known as a former YouTube channel, so I know personally what it's like to A, have derogatory and outright false accusations levied at you regarding your current creative output, B, having your past thrown in your face and used as a weapon against you, C, having your successes be downplayed, and D, having your intentions and mindset regarding your current creative output called into question for reasons that usually boil down to, I liked your old stuff and not your new stuff, therefore your new stuff couldn't possibly be made genuinely. All by people who don't even know what my name is, let alone what my mindset is. But with that said, it would be ignorant to say that just because something has traditionally been unpopular, that doesn't mean it doesn't have the potential to be so. Fire Emblem, from what I understand, was a series that was very close to getting the axe before Awakening came out and was by far the biggest success story the series had ever seen. It was such a turnaround that it even inspired me to check out the series when Fates came out. I regret it to this day, but it was there. The same goes for Metroid, which saw its greatest success only in recent years after a long hiatus. How about Xenoblade, a series that Nintendo had so little faith in, its original release on the Wii was a GameStop exclusive back in the day, now it's considered one of the top Nintendo franchises. Ace Attorney was another one that kind of just existed for a while, but now it's found its audience after they re-released the trilogy on modern consoles. Crash and Spyro had their biggest successes after taking a significant hiatus. Both Ratchet & Clank and God of War completely fell off sales-wise before experiencing their greatest booms in more recent years. What exactly it is that makes a traditionally unpopular franchise have a sudden boom period, or what it is that revitalizes a dormant franchise, there are multiple factors that can go into it, and there's no telling what will and won't rise from the ashes one of these days. But a lot of franchises don't get a second chance at a first impression, and support begins at the grassroots. You have to be willing to support these things in any way you can as they come up. Back when Medieval got a remake, I bought it no questions asked. I love the world and the atmosphere, so I would have loved to see the franchise be supported further. But evidently, not a lot of people bought the remake. Same goes for that remaster of Parappa the Rapper that came out several years back. How many people actually bought it? Or how about that remaster of Ape Escape 2 you can buy right now? You might even have to plug your nose and buy something that was botched, such as the re-releases of the Jak and Daxter games. Because good or bad, it shows you're putting your money where your mouth is. How many legacy collections are out there for things like Mega Man and Castlevania, and how many of these franchises have games that you can still buy new copies of right now, physically or digitally? This is not me blaming the audience, this is more so a call to action. If you want a niche franchise to come back, you can't unfortunately be picky about how you support them. you need to buy every new release even if you don't jive with the current offerings. For example, I know a Mega Man fan who bought the Battle Network Legacy Collection despite having no interest in Battle Network because he just wanted to support the franchise and encourage Capcom to make more. It's unfortunate, but most companies have no vested interest in what does and does not succeed. They just follow the money. Fire Emblem didn't randomly become a success one day, and the only way to prove that there's money in something is to spend it and maybe even encourage your friends and family to do the same. Just hopefully not in an annoying or toxic way, because nothing is sure to make someone do the opposite of what you want them to do than if you ask them to do it in an annoying way or harass them. And speaking of harassment, I just have two final requests in regards to conduct surrounding dead or dormant franchises. First of all, don't harass developers if they're not making the games you want them to make. I saw some really not nice things aimed at Insomniac Games on Twitter for daring to make that Wolverine game instead of the next Ratchet & Clank game. Don't be that guy. Second of all, I really want to encourage people to appreciate the things they have instead of just lamenting the non-existence of hypothetical sequels. For example, there's over 100 Mega Man games. If you think about it, that's pretty cool because how many franchises have that many games? And the same can apply to many franchises, even those with only a few games. There's nothing wrong with wanting more, but sometimes it feels like people want more at the expense of what they already have, even if what they have is still fairly new. Like, I've seen it pretty consistently where a new release comes out and people enjoy it, then like 6 months later you see people on Twitter saying, okay, well, where's the next one? Which is just short-sighted to me. So if there's anything to take away from this video, it's just because you like something, it doesn't make it important or popular. Not liking something that is popular doesn't mean that other people don't, and it doesn't diminish the overall popularity or importance. Don't oversell the importance of something. Wanting something is fine, demanding is not. Don't be a dick. Change can only begin with you. It's okay for things to be niche. The popularity of something should not diminish your ability to enjoy it, and more than anything, sometimes life isn't fair, so we don't get what we want. But we should appreciate what we have. There. Hopefully I've communicated this point in a succinct and hopefully good faith way that will communicate the issue without pissing too many people off. I didn't say any of this to be a dick or a tool, I just wanted to communicate a sentiment that I feel needed to be said for a long time. And if you feel I was mean-spirited, I genuinely apologize because that was not my intention. But if you like what I do here and want to support the channel, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support me in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, exclusive content, and more, along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Billy Not Brooklyn, Dick Kickham, Gaw004, MyNameIsTank, Knob Varley, Patchwork, Raaf, TyTrovy, and WeirdWebbster for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.